We value things. We wanted our relationship to be important more than we wanted to be right, more than we were stubborn. And so, there really is a useful practicality to sitting down and saying, what are the things that we value, that we both value? Let's focus on that instead of how to accomplish it, because what you'll find is if you stop expecting your spouse to act like you or do things the way you would do them, you're on one step toward finding some real value. If you're struggling in your marriage or wondering if it's even salvageable, before you give up, let us come alongside you with a biblical vision for marriage. We bring a counselor's heart and a pastor's heart into the mix to equip you and encourage you for lifelong love.
Today's episode of The Vision Driven Marriage is brought to you by the Blessed Family Recovery Summit, happening October 24th through the 26th. Now, if you have ever felt overwhelmed by the challenges of addiction in your family, this summit is for you. It's more than just an event. It's an opportunity to find strength, hope, and healing in the midst of the chaos. Proverbs 13:12 tells us that hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. And if you're in a season of feeling like hope is slipping away, this summit is designed to show you that there's support and a path forward. You don't have to walk this journey alone. There will be 16 inspiring speakers who have walked similar paths. You'll also hear faith-based strategies for healing and practical tools to help you navigate your relationship with an addicted loved one. This summit is packed with resources to help you reclaim peace in your home. You'll learn how to guide your loved one without losing yourself in the process. So if you're ready for hope, healing, and practical steps forward, be sure to join us for the Blessed Family Recovery Summit, October 24th through the 26th. For more information, check the link in the show notes. You don't want to miss this.
Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. We're Doug and Leslie Davis. We are so glad that you're here with us today. Today we're going to be looking at unity in marriage, focusing on values over methods.
You know, there was a lot of things that we got right. And I think that sometimes the things that we got right by happenstance, that we kind of just got them right by accident. And looking back on them, we can tell that it was an accident, that it was God's provision for our marriage and for our lives. But we did end up being able to recognize some core values as we looked back on our marriage and how we really did focus on those core values as opposed to focusing on methods. And that gave us a sense of unity in our marriage that like I said, we kind of began as happenstance, didn't it?
Right. But the reason that it was such a blessing and we didn't realize was we each had methods that we were used to. We had methods that we had grown accustomed to. But the value that we had was we valued our relationship and the unity that was going to come from being willing to do something different. And there were a couple of times where Leslie was the one who decided she'd do things the way that I'd been doing them. And there were some things where I decided I would do some things the way she had been doing them, simply because our value was the relationship, not having to win or not the method. And two of the funniest examples, when we first got married, setting up something as simple as setting up which direction the dishes would be washed for the washing, rinsing, and then putting them into the strainer.
If you're watching on YouTube, you can see that his hands went from
left
to the right. At my house, we went from the right to the left.
Right.
And I think probably that was because, the old farmhouse that we grew up in, that's how the cabinet space
That's where the counter space
was. So that's how we did it, right? So then when we moved into town when I was 13, we just continued to do it that way.
Right. And you don't even realize that when it's something that's a method, if you've been doing it for the majority of your life, or at least for the majority of your adult life with other things that you may be wrestling with in your marriage, that it becomes so ingrained that the method becomes something that you care about. But the value that you when you have a shared value, you're able to look past methods. And in this particular case, Leslie was able to say, I'll go left to right instead of right to left, following the method that I was used to rather than the method she was used to, simply because she valued our relationship more than which direction the dishes should go across the sink into the strainer. And one of the things that I showed that same value at her house. She grew up in a house where she had a sister and her dad was there, but especially with the sister, the toilet seat was completely down. Okay,
all the time.
All the time. I grew up in a house of 4 boys and 1 sister, and yes, pray for my sister. But because of that, it was one of those where, regardless of who you are, you look before you use the bathroom. If you need it up, you put it up. If you need it down, you put it down. But you look. There wasn't a. It always goes down.
Look before you leave.
Before you leap. Because we didn't want my sister to have left it down and the boys to pee on the lid. We didn't want it to be up and my sister to sit. And so there wasn't the method was just very different. But again, because I valued the relationship, it wasn't a big deal at all. It wasn't one of those things where it took a long time to adjust. It was something that I knew the value in our relationship was more important than the method I'd grown up with, and so it went down and it stayed down all the time.
But what we see so often with couples that we work with is they get extremely hung up on the methods, and that just opens the floodgate for criticism within that relationship. And when we're operating in our flesh, that's what happens, because in our flesh we tend to be more self-focused than not. But the underlying concept is that we want our spouse to be like us. And it gives us some type of comfort,
or we think we do.
Yes, or we think we do, right? I think I want him to adjust the way he does the dishes from to the right to the left, because I want to have some comfort in thinking that I'm okay in this, or somehow that if I needed to change which way I did it, that means which way I did it was wrong to start with. And you see, that's not the case. It's just different. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of times when it's okay for a husband and a wife to be different. God has made us different.
Right. But the shared values is where the unity comes in. Because what you've probably already discovered with your spouse is that your spouse does things really well that you don't do well, and vice versa. And you can even do the same thing so very differently. You're not the same people. God's made you differently. You're wired differently. And so when we think we want sameness, there's usually an issue that we have to overcome in all of that.
Yeah. Last week we talked to Don Manning, and if you haven't caught that episode, I would encourage you to jump back to that. It was our 80th episode of the Vision Driven Marriage podcast, so we were kind of celebrating the big 80, But he talked about how him and his wife homeschool, and they approached that task very differently. Right. And he was saying if she would be just more like me, it would be so much easier to get this task done. But that wasn't honoring how God had made her and the task that God had gave her in that homeschooling. Now they got some ground on some unity in a common value, which is the value of their children's education. They both held that common value very high, but they realized that they were both going to be taking that task differently.
Yeah. And, in our marriage, we've seen so many times where we'll have a shared value, but the way that we do it's so very different. It would be easy for us to think, and by the way, I've learned it would be wrong for me to think, but it would be easy for me to think, she should probably do this the way I do it. Or if she's not doing it the way I do it, maybe I should come in and help in some way. And the reality,
I laugh because that never works.
And the reality is that's almost never going to be a good idea. Now, occasionally, do you notice I said almost never?
Almost
Sometimes you can come in and help and get, but let me give you a piece of
I'm
advice.
too pig-headed for you to do that.
Well, both of us are. And as a spouse, if you want that kind of assistance and help, ask for it. Otherwise, you need to realize they probably aren't looking for that kind of assistance and help. But Leslie mentioned that, jokingly, that she's pigheaded. The reality is both of us are pretty pigheaded in what we want, but we value things. We wanted our relationship to be important more than we wanted to be right, more than we were stubborn. And so, there really is a useful practicality to sitting down and saying, what are the things that we value, that we both value? Let's focus on that instead of how to accomplish it, because what you'll find is if you stop expecting your spouse to act like you or do things the way you would do them, you're on one step toward finding some real value.
Absolutely. I know Amos 3:3 says, do not two people walk together unless they have agreed to do so. Mm-hmm. I think that is a good picture of what it looks like when you agree on shared values.
Right.
And listeners, if you're struggling with what shared values you might have as a couple, right, let me encourage you to schedule a discovery call with us. I'll link the link in the show notes. It's free. It's a free discovery call. Hop on a call with us and we'll help you discover some of the shared values that you might have. It's actually a really fun exercise to go through.
Absolutely. And so those shared values are where you find the unity, not in doing things the same way. It's not going to be the same task. But when you discover
it might be the same task, but we'll go about it different ways.
Not the same method.
Yes.
Not the same method.
Yeah, not the same method. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things to note here is that when you're noticing your spouse working on a shared value, a task that falls under a shared value, and their method's not the same as yours, which is kind of what we've been talking about, right?
And pretty normal.
Yeah, oh yeah, this is extremely normal. The thing about it is that you have to kind of evaluate how much you trust your spouse in getting that task done. And ladies, I this is where we really struggle. We really struggle with, do I trust my spouse to do some of these things that are encompassing in this shared value, even when they're not doing it like we would do it? And I think that, the Bible is very clear about us taking the leadership role from our husbands. And I think this is where it comes in, because we don't trust that, even like we've agreed on a shared value, and if we don't trust that he's working toward that shared value, what we see is him not doing it the way we would do it. Ladies, we have to check our hearts and say, okay, he might not be doing it the same way that we would do it. He doesn't have the same method that we would do it. But we're working toward a shared goal, and you have to trust the process.
Same goal, same value. And, we see that even in the church. We know that God says that we as the church are members of one body. We have very different gifts, but we have the same spirit. And it's the marriage application of that verse is what we're talking about. Leslie had addressed you ladies that you're going to see that there are times your husband doesn't do the thing you would do the way you would do it. But if you can trust that there's a shared value, totally different gift. Your husband was made different than you were made. Mm-hmm. But if you can have the same value working toward the same goal, and you can trust that that's true, let me just encourage you with this instead of letting you get frustrated with it. God made your husband different than you on purpose.
Yes.
He really did. It was on purpose. And husbands, God made your wife different from you on purpose. And so she's able to do things you can't do, fellas. So understand that there's something beautiful about the fact that when you have a shared goal, you're going to be able to look at each other and genuinely say, well, that's pretty cool. I wouldn't have done it that way. That's awesome. Instead of, I wouldn't have done it that way. You're wrong. Because when you have a shared goal, you get to see the beauty of, well, that's pretty cool. I would have never got that part done.
See, what I like about how you just described it is because that really does just kick criticism in the butt.
It does.
I mean, when you're focused on a shared value and not the method, there's no room for criticism.
Right.
I mean, it just doesn't leave the place for criticism.
Right.
I'll give you an example of one of the times where I had to trust the process. I valued our relationship, so there wasn't a place for criticism. And that was when it came to disciplining our daughters.
Right.
And many of you have heard our story. We have 4 daughters. They're all now grown. The youngest one is 24. So we're empty nesters. But when they were young and he was in that disciplinary role, he never did it in front of me. And therefore, it left a void in my mind that he wasn't doing it, or worse, he wasn't doing it correctly. And I had to trust the process. Like, I had to trust that he, one, had my back, because that was a priority, that we would always be on the same page when it came to disciplining our children. But because he would never do it in front of me, I had to just trust that process, that it was happening, and that our values were the same. And guess what? Our values were the same. His method wasn't the same as my method, and which is really a good thing. But the process went great.
Right. And in case you're wondering, when our oldest was the only one we had, of course, she was very small. Disciplinary things were very different. It wasn't that I didn't want to discipline in front of her, just so you all understand. It was that we had 4 kids, and so whichever one had gotten to that final stage where they're in trouble, she and I would go over and we would have a discussion and we would work through things.
So it wasn't just
and
in
so
front of me. It was not
just
in front of everybody. Right.
So she got pulled. And so as a result, one of the things that it took time to be able to understand, and the girls were able to explain that eventually once they started to get it, was that the very first thing that I would always say to them is, what did your mom say to you? What did your mother say? So it wasn't just that I had her back. Everything was based on her and on that. We had this shared value of making sure that we were able to raise our children together and to actually bring ourselves closer to each other instead of letting the kids try to put a wedge between us. Because every kid is automatically wired to figure out how to play you against your spouse.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, they'll say, Dad said it's okay if you do.
Yeah.
They don't even have to learn how to do that. They just know.
Yeah, I think they do. I think there's
I
just
think they're
something
born
innate.
that way.
Yeah, there's just something innate in them that they have to be taught that mom and dad are on the same page, right? Are you dealing with addiction in your family? Proverbs 13:12 says, "Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is the tree of life." But when we place our hope in Christ alone, we find hope that never fails, a hope that anchors our souls, as Hebrews 6:19 reminds us. This fall, join us for the Blessed Family Recovery Summit 2024, a free summit where we come together to find God in the midst of the struggle of addiction. Blessed Family Recovery Summit, Finding God Amidst Addiction, October 24th through the 26th. Join us at blessedfamilyrecoverysummit.com. The thing about this process, having these shared values in place, the thing about it that it kicks criticism in the butt, that leaves room for appreciation.
Yes.
And I want to say, being able to be appreciative in your relationship is a skill, and it's a skill that needs to be practiced. But when it's practiced and perfected, it is so powerful.
And there's several things that Leslie's able to do that I just can't do at all. And so when we look at some of our shared values, it puts us working toward a similar goal. But she's able to do things so very differently than I can because she's been given gifts and abilities I just don't have. It would be really cool if I did. I don't. And so I really appreciate it. And, she cares so very much about perspectives. Right. But she sees things from other people's perspectives and I don't.
If you did, you wouldn't need me, though.
I still would.
I'd be out of a job.
But one of the things that, when you realize she's doing it so very differently than not only I would, she's doing things differently than I'm able. And, being able
vice versa.
And being able to recognize that not only am I not going to be critical, hey, that's not the way I would do it, I'm able to now step in and say, I love the way that you see things from other people's perspective, because I just don't. I'm so glad you do. And the appreciation is able to come from the differences because we know we're working on the same goal, toward the same goal, with the same heart, and it brings us closer to one another.
Yeah. And I think when you find that there's strife in a task and getting a task done, it might be because you're focused on the methods and not on the shared value.
Right.
And that may be time for, for a relationship check. Maybe back out of the task and say, okay, are we focusing on the method, or do we need to sit down and define what the core value is here,
Right.
what we're both working toward? And, that could take as little as 5 minutes,
Right.
just to sit down and unpack that together. Because what it does is it just gives you an opportunity to remind you, both the husband and the wife, that you're on the same team.
Right. And there's some times where you're going to not only have the same value, but there will be certain of those values where you actually do use the same method. You can do those things together. You can encourage each other because you are doing things similarly. But there's also going to be those times, and right now they may be the places where you're struggling, where you need to recognize the unique giftedness of your spouse because they're so very different than you are.
Yeah. And two, there may be a time when you sit down and you have to agree on a method.
Right.
And the thing about that is that when you sit down and define what that method needs to look like by your shared values,
Right.
it'll be much easier to have that collaboration on what the method might be.
Mm-hmm.
And
when you are, regardless of what phase of your marriage you're in, you may be still in the honeymoon phase and figuring out what those shared values are is a new thing. Or you may be having to reevaluate what some of your values are because you're in the early family stage where your children are pretty little. And the things that you value are still there, but there's new things you value now that you didn't have to worry about before. You may be in the messy middle where you've got, 4 kids and 2 of them are hanging off the curtains and one of them's running through, jumped out of the bathtub running down the hallway.
Yeah.
But your values are going to be something that you get to continue to evaluate as and they'll change a little bit. There's going to be the core values that are going to be the same throughout your whole marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be those other values that you really need to look at and understand that we need to sit down and figure out what are the most important things for us. Now, again, we want to encourage you not only to sit down and figure out what your values are, but figure out what your values are for the moment that you're in, not just your long-term ones. Like, when our kids were little, one of our values was we want our children to continue, even if they need help, rather than quitting, to finish a task. And so, that's frustrating for kids sometimes because almost every toy is picked up, but the toys aren't all picked up, so let's finish the task.
So
but
that
as a shared value,
would be what? Tenacity.
Yeah.
Right?
So as a shared
Hard work
value,
and
that was
tenacity.
something that we cared about not only in our relationship, but we wanted to pass it on to our kids. And so the way that she would go about teaching that tenacity, that stick-to-itiveness was different than the way that I would do it. But because we had the shared goal, we could appreciate and value what the other one was doing, even though it was very different than we would have.
And you supported me in the way that I did that. So that was also very, very helpful. Yeah. I know one of our other shared values was honesty.
Yeah.
They're like, I don't even know how to, because we just don't lie
just
to
own
each
it.
other.
Yeah, just own it.
Right. We just don't lie to each other. And if there was something that was said that was not true, we just owned it. We owned up to it and we fixed it.
Right.
And so, and it was never, I would say always and never, but it was never intentional.
Right.
We didn't intentionally. That came out of a childhood hurt. A lot of times God uses those childhood hurts, and how he redeems them is he uses them to develop the core values that you then use in the life that the Lord has put you into, like in your parenting roles, in your ministry roles, in your marriage.
Right.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true, because we know that, the brokenness, the places that were broken in us when we were little were places that not only God was good to bring healing and to help us through it, but that's where we developed those values that may be a little bit different than what we'd had previously. And so, you may even be going through some kind of a hurt right now, hold on to the hope and the truth that as you come through the other side, leaning on the Lord through it, you're going to develop values that will be so wonderfully unique and so much of a blessing to you, because they're not only going to protect you, they're going to give you the opportunity to see what's good instead of just focusing on the hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. That'll preach. Right? That'll preach. And so, speaking of preaching, our closing scripture is Ecclesiastes 4:9-12.
Yeah.
2 are better than 1, and it continues on. A cord of 3 strands are not quickly broken. I would encourage you to read the whole set of that scripture, and I will have that
Ecclesiastes 4.
Yeah, Ecclesiastes. Did I say 4?
You did. Yeah, you did.
Okay. I'll have that in the show notes so you can read that entire scripture.
Right.
But understanding that when it says a 3-fold cord is not easily broken, that's you and your spouse and Christ.
Yeah.
And that is so very important, because the Lord is going to lead you to be a better spouse than what you could be on your own. And I am living proof of that. Like, if I feel like if Doug had actually known who I was, he wouldn't have married me. But
I still would have.
but I became a Cub fan by default. So
Well, and we just want to encourage you. As you're seeking out those values, understand what God wants to show your heart and wants to teach your mind. Through these wonderful shared values, you're reminded that you get the privilege to complement one another, not copy one another. You're not supposed to be alike. You're supposed to be like-minded.
Yeah.
And what's the difference? You don't have to do things the same way, but you need to be focused on the same goals and the same purposes. And that will give you an advantage that that the rest of the world doesn't fully understand, because when you are like-minded, not trying to make your spouse be like you, you'll see the blessings of those wonderful, unique things that God's blessed your spouse with and gifted your spouse with.
yeah, absolutely. I love that. We are meant to complement, not to copy each other. I really like that.
Right.
And so yeah, if you guys are struggling with, again, what your core values might be, I'll encourage you again to schedule a vision session with us. We would be more than happy to sit down with you and run through a nice little exercise on how to determine your core values.
Right. And if you have an idea, sit down with your spouse and have a conversation and come up with the values that you know that you have in common. We're Doug and Leslie Davis. This is the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. And as always, we are praying that God will solidify your marriage.